Hi everybody, my name is Z. I'm from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Very happy to be here today at ACSS. And I'm here to present my new project titled The Unequal Alliance, Explaining the Low Number of Military Coups in Communist States. So without further ado, let's begin. Before I start, I would like to offer some sincere appreciations to ACSS, first and foremost, for providing me this platform. Also, Georgetown University's Asian Studies program. My thesis advisor, Dr. Victor Cha, the Lounger Library at Georgetown, and my friend and colleague, Adam Greer, for supporting my research and associated endeavors. So, thank you very much. Let's start with a quick introduction. Uh, so, the central question of my research is that how come military coups seldom occur in communist states? And when they do occur, why? I came by this question last year during the Thai coup. I was watching the news, and reporters were saying that this is Thailand's, nth coup since it became a constitutional monarchy, and really makes me wonder, why some countries are so prone to coups. Some countries are rather resistant to coups. Does it have something to do with the type of regime that's governing the state? And when I started doing research about it, I found out that in the past 64 years, there were a total of 481 coups around the world, and only 9 occurred in communist states. So that's a very interesting number, because if you compare it to uh, other regime types, the communist states are quite resistant, towards military coups. And speaking of which, here's a pie chart I created showing total number of coups from 1950 to 2014 according to regime types. As you can see, democracy comes in first, uh, takes up almost about 50% of all coups in the last 64 years. Authoritarian states are also quite vulnerable. In the third is monarchy and constitutional monarchy, and communist single party states, the lowest number. And just to show you the 9 coups that occurred in communist states in the past 6 decades, as you can see, most of these states are developing world, quote unquote people's republics. Uh, you have South Yemen, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Angola, and uh, Grenada, Afghanistan. And when I studied coups in these countries, I didn't really notice any difference between why these coups occurred in these countries versus why it occurred in other, you know, uh, developing countries such as Bolivia, Argentina, or Syria. Personal vendetta and tribal allegiance plays a huge role, and I just don't see how the Leninist government's governing system actually helps uh, prevent or or facilitate coups. And then when I dig deeper into it, found out that most of these developing people's republics, they're more communist in name only. Sure, some of their policies are very oriented towards Marxist uh, policies in Marxist country, established Marxist countries, but most of them, I would say, they're only following the ideology, but they were never able to establish a firm control of the entire country, and instability was quite um, prevalent. And for the most part, these countries they could not even consolidate a Leninist governing system. And just a few years after, several of these states were plunged into prolonged civil wars or foreign wars. So that's one thing I believe why the coups in these developing world people's republics are really no different from coups in the other developing states. But if you look at Poland and Soviet Union, you notice there's a difference because they're established. They have an established Leninist system, and we're going to use them as case studies to see why communist states are rather resistant towards military coups. My argument comes in two parts. First is that I argue the relationship between the military and the Communist Party is one that could be characterized as an unequal alliance. where both parties rule the country in tandem, but the Communist Party is one at the commanding post, and the military follows the Communist Party due to ideology and etc. and other reasons. I'm going to elaborate further later on. And the second part of my argument is that I argue military coups occurred in established communist states when the military leadership perceives the party as weak and incompetent when it comes to handling a domestic crisis that's threatening the very survival of the regime. And we see this in both the Polish and the Soviet case. Quick literature review. Some authors have explored a general question of why coups occur, why some coups have successful outcomes, some do not. Other authors have written extensively on party-military relations in the Soviet Union, like William Odom, the gentleman in the lower right corner. But none have really connected all the dots between regime types and how it influences the occurrence of military coups in the country. Eric Nordlinger comes close. However, his penetration model focused more on how a certain state used ideology to control the military, rather than talking about specifically about the communist system and its influence on the occurrence of coups. So, a brief point on party-military relations in communist countries. So, how does the ruling Communist Party maintain its alliance with the military? In other words, how does the Communist Party make sure the military is loyal? I would say there's 5 keywords we need to remember, and they all start with the letter P. So it's the 5 P's of party-military relations: political officers, propaganda, purse strings, promotion, and privileges. Political officers, meaning the commissar system that exists in most established communist states. I would say the commissar is pretty much, he is a political officer. He's a loyal party member. He could that's depends on which country you're talking about. In China, he has more power. He could override the commanding officer's orders. But in the former Soviet Union, initially it had more power, but it began to recede as time moved on. But still, the political officers have a lot of they have power in terms of recommending the commanding officer for promotion. So definitely, if you want to get promoted, you want to move up the ranks in the military, you have to have good relations with the political officer, meaning you have to be a devotee to the party. Also, within the military, besides the political officers, you also have a network of informers. So these informers are more hidden. They will watch for ideological deviance within the military to ensure that everybody is on the same plane in terms of following the party line. Propaganda, we don't have to elaborate too much on that. Purse strings, meaning the budget. The party controls the military's budget, and if the military want to get what it wants, you have to strike some kind of compromise or just follow the party's order in general. Promotion, if you want to get promoted in the communist military, you have to be a party member, and especially when you're moving up high in the ranks, you have to be a party member, and you have to show loyalty to the party. Privileges, well, communist militaries usually have enjoy special privileges that's not available to the general population. In the Soviet Union, it means better living standards, better material goods. In today's China, for example, you have the same similar story. Before Xi Jinping's anti-corruption crackdown, there's a lot of abuse of military privileges. For example, expensive banquets, certain type of liquor that's specially available to generals, officers, special and the military license plates, which pretty much gives you a diplomatic immunity that's abused quite often by military officers. And nowadays, of course, the Chinese government has already tried to crack down on this, And below you'll see the Chinese military's new slogan, which is "Follow the party's commands, able to win wars, and exemplary in conduct," which is basically a replay on Mao's dictum that the party must always control the gun rather than other way around, and that's pretty applicable to most established communist states. So let's talk about case studies. The case of Poland. As you can see, here's the General Jaruzelski, the leader of the 1981 Polish coup. Why did it happen? Actually, the army has always been a tool of repression used by the ruling Polish United Workers' Party against a population that is quite indignant because it saw the communist government in Poland as pretty much a puppet of the Soviet Union. The army helped the state suppress two uprisings, one in the 1950s, one in the 1970s. But later on, with the rise of the Solidarity movement in the late 70s and 80s, it's a labor-centered movement that demanded greater freedom in terms of association and better living standards, and later on expanded to all sectors of Polish society. At one point, Solidarity had more members than the Communist Party of Poland, which really says something about its power. And this movement forced the Polish government into a compromising position because there's no way it could, at least the government perceived it could crack down upon Solidarity. So as the government began to compromise, the backer of the Polish communist state, the Soviet Union, began to push, especially for the military, to crack down on the Solidarity movement because it does not want to see a domino effect within the Eastern Bloc. And when negotiation began to stall, the army began to get very anxious about where the negotiations with Solidarity is going. Because within the Solidarity movement, there's also difference in leadership, and they want different things from the government. So when the negotiations stalled, the army moved in. First, they pushed out the conciliatory Polish party secretary, and they began to crack down on Solidarity in December when the coup was announced. And the junta was formed on the 13th of December to take over the function of the government. And that is the Polish case. As you can see, it is a response to a sustained crisis. And similar things happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviet August 1991 coup. The Soviet when Gorbachev came to power, he initiated a series of policies, series of reform and progressive policies. That's glasnost, democratization, perestroika, and perestroika. Nowadays when we look back on these policies, we see them as progressive and positive. But during that time, when you suddenly release, very strict control from the regimented Soviet society, you seeing a lot of economic corruption when you're transferring state assets to individuals. You see a sudden unleash of nationalist sentiments from different ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, and it caused a lot of difficulties in everyday life. Especially the nationalists, they've been agitating for greater autonomy or straight up independence ever since Glasnost. For 4 years straight, the Soviet Union is in a state of constant crisis. And the military men, of course, when they witness this, they're not very happy. And especially when Gorbachev wanted to reform the military, noticing the deep-rooted corruption within the Soviet military. There were, of course, these top brass were not going along with that at all. So they saw Gorbachev as the chief culprit for turning the country upside down. And that's when they plotted a coup and struck August 1991. Of course, the coup failed after 3 days, but still, you notice a pattern that the military dislike instability within the country, and if the political leadership cannot handle the crisis, the military is more than happy to step in. Here's a comparison of the Polish and Soviet case. The duration of the domestic crisis in Poland is about a year, Soviet Union 4 years. Both are sustained by the masses in a way. And they were able to continue partly because of the government's, quote unquote weak posture towards the demonstrations, the mass movements. And both coups are executed by high-ranking military officials seeking to restore stability, especially from their view. And in conclusion, I would say the party and the military are both benefactors of the Communist Party system, making them allies. But being opportunistic political entities, they'll safeguard the system from collapsing as long as it still has some value to hold on to. And if the party is hesitant to take on this role, the military is, more than happy to rise to the occasion. All right, I want to thank you, and I'm open for questions.